So today I am particularly delighted to welcome to our chat Sebastian Schaal, founder and managing director of Luminovo, one of these new cool companies in the digital supply chain tool world. Hi, Sebastian.
Hi, Georg. Super excited to be here.
Thank you. So let me start with my usual first question. Can you give me 30 seconds elevator pitch on what Luminovo is doing?
Sure, very glad to do so. So Luminovo is a tech startup out of Munich, Germany, and we are developing software as a service solutions to simplify the electronic supply chain for designers and manufacturers. So concretely, what you can do in our software is you can manage your bill of material, printed circuit board data, manufacturing and supply chain data all in one place. You can then monitor all the risks that are involved in these projects and resolve issues on the spot. And you can also automate important business processes in the supply chain, like quoting and procurement. And what we ultimately want to do with this is that we want to help companies bring their products to market faster, cheaper, and more sustainably.
Thank you. That was almost within time limits. So you actually led me on to the first question. In the components market, we are coming out of an allocation that lasted for 2 years. And one of the big requests of many, many customers was that the supply chain itself, the component supply chain, gets more transparent. So the glass pipeline is actually the buzzword that has been used quite a lot. My question to you would be, what do you think is the current status of digitization of the supply chain in our world, and what do you think needs to happen in order to make it better?
Yeah, that's definitely a very good point. So I think if we have seen the disruption in the supply chain over the last years, really, I think fueled by the COVID pandemic, I see that we have seen that a lot of processes were still mainly relying on email, Excel, and a lot of manual work. And I guess this was never a great idea, but it was always good enough. But really now with the crisis, this was fundamentally starting to break. But luckily, I think early in that phase, we already had some suppliers that had already started to embark on a digitization strategy, like the distributors offering web shops and APIs, so application interfaces, which then really allowed some players like us to integrate with these APIs and provide a platform for a more digital and transparent supply chain, because these endpoints were really then able to uncover, like as you said, building up that class pipeline to increase resilience in the supply chain. So I think that has basically fueled this whole endeavor. What I've also seen with this whole shift is that there was an initial resistance towards the cloud or changing something in general, and I feel that this has slowly kind of degraded, but some companies are still struggling with it. So as you said, the status, there's definitely has been a journey to get started, but it's still a long way to go. Yeah.
My observation in the last 2 to 3 years was that a lot of companies have started, as you said, building, let's say, platforms, whether it's e-commerce or whether it's interactive solutions like API or BOM platforms and so on. A lot of things have happened, but it's all kinds of different islands, not really connected very well. And my question would be, digitization in itself is nice, but it does not really provide a crisis if things are not connected well. So from a manufacturer of components down to the end user, I think there are still a lot of bottlenecks or, let's say, broken lines that have prevented us from actually doing a better job in managing the risks.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. I think there's still a lot of challenges there. And I think that digitization is something that you can't do alone. There's it's a collective effort of the industry. And I think that's within a company, it's already a challenge, to kind of connect different stakeholders, as you said, like designers, engineers, the buyers, to bring them on one single source of truth in the organization is already hard. But then out of the organizations, it's really it's a tough start. And I think that's what your question was what's happening next. And I think the train has left the station. Many suppliers are starting to digitize, and that's like a big opportunity. Also, when you think about topics like carbon accounting and sustainability, where I think there is just no other way than having like standardized interfaces, supply chains talking to each other to kind of get more transparency also on that front.
Well, these information requirements are, I think, well, they are necessary now, but the let's say implementation is still somewhere in the future, because some of the critical data from manufacturers are missing to create, for example, a carbon footprint on a single component. I would guess that you still need a lot of information that aren't there today. But coming back to the glass pipeline, so what do you think, from your experience, are the major, or is the major bottleneck currently? Which process or transaction?
That's I think when we look from like top to bottom, everything starts in the design, right? And I think currently designers are still often flying blind when it comes to a lot of these risks about supply chain compliance, but also manufacturability. And I think one of the biggest bottlenecks is that this information is still stuck, similar like you just said, with the manufacturers, with the suppliers, and where it would desperately be needed in the design phase. So I think that's one bottleneck from those stakeholders. For the procurements or buyer side, I think it's really this collaboration with internally with the engineers, also with the manufacturers and suppliers, that is missing to get more foresight, which is one of the issues. And if you think about the contract manufacturers down the line, I think they're the biggest struggle that they have is really this kind of quoting process, which sounds something as a simple business process, but you know it's a very tough one, as if you have to somehow reverse engineer a full product and quote. And there's so much time still spent and wasted in a skilled labor shortage market where we are. So these are, I think, the three bottlenecks for the different stakeholders. And yeah, if the information would just flow easier, I think we could all sleep better at night.
I remember the running gag in distribution about quoting process in EMS companies was death by quoting. Specifically, if you talk about small quantities, and there are literally thousands of that process of that transactions every day, and to find a solution for that would not only ease up the work, but also eventually bring more, let's say, insight into the actual information flow. This is also something that Sourceability works on quite intensively with DataLink, and we are also partnering with you regarding the quoting process. And I think if you look at the personas that we cater to, both the main personas are really engineers, as you mentioned, and the buyers. Do you think that there is a major difference in the way they are using these digital tools? And second is, what do you think is the influence on their actual jobs?
Yeah.
So how would the jobs look like in the future?
Yeah. So I think with these tools, starting with the engineers, I think they are finally getting something like a supply chain co-pilot. I mean, that's been a term that we see now a lot in the media, that is kind of really there, that they don't have to fly solo anymore. It's there with them, that's monitoring all the implications in the design that is going on, right? Supply risks, like knowing which part is available, what is obsolete when there's a looming end of life, compliance risk, REACH, ROAS, CO2 topics we talked about, but also real world manufacturing risks, right? What's the DFM implications of my board? What's the assembly risk that's maybe with the few contract manufacturers I have close collaboration with? And I think these tools will really act as a design assistant for them to provide real-time insights in their knowledge, really, as I said, as a co-pilot sitting there working through these supply chain issues with them. So I think that's the change I see for the engineering side. And for the buyers, I think the value of like strategic procurement is going to definitely increase a lot, because the repetitive operational part of procurement will be more and more automized with APIs. So there should be less headaches about manual quote requests, purchase orders, or putting something manually into your ERP system. And it's really ideally not worrying about already made decisions, but really making sure that you're strategically like nurturing long-term supplier relationships, making strategic moves to increase resilience. So all this kind of busy work ideally can be taken over by machines, where then we really have to just focus on the really things that move the needle. But that's
Mhm.
definitely a spectrum, right? There's another shift that happens overnight. So we will see more and more automation from the bottom up, and allowing the buyers to work more strategically.
I think that's a very critical point, because from a distribution perspective, I think the purchasing process is the one that is, I would say, most cumbersome on both sides, because it seems to be very often only about the price, but never about the cost of ownership. And I know cost of ownership calculations since I'm in the industry, so over 30 years, but it never has really caught up with most of the purchasing departments. At the end, it really came down to the component price. And I think this is potentially something we need to move away. And what you described for the engineers, I really like the terminology, the supply chain co-pilot. I think that's a good way to describe it. From a pure components perspective, what I experienced over years of customer surveys and customer councils is that we were never able to really utilize all the data that we had in distribution and turn it into useful information. It was just data. It was sitting somewhere, but it was never something useful to, let's say, provide something like an early warning system on potential supply chain risks and so on. So this is eventually a way or a road we need to go.
Yeah, fully agree with you.
So my next question is around tier one suppliers and the connection to potential exchange platforms. So if everyone thinks he can develop his own glass pipeline for his own purpose, I think it still will lead to a situation in the future where we have another cycle. Well, we'll have another cycle for sure, but maybe one with less severe consequences as the last 2 years. But if all people think they are big enough to develop their own glass pipeline, I think we are still jumping short of what's possible if we create a bigger and hopefully more transparent overall platform for the industry. How do you think? Do you think that is actually possible, that people say, finally, we need to know what's out there in the market, where it sits, and how we can get it?
Yeah, so this idea of a gold standard. Yeah, I mean, if I look at first principles,
the problem is big. Think
Yeah.
about it. We have the electronics industry has about 100 million, more than 100 million, maybe 200 million different products that are put somewhere on board. The complexity is absolutely mind-boggling. And if you cannot, well, if you always miss the golden screw at the end of a design, that's not good, because the rest is then just dead capital on your inventory or on your working capital. And that's why I think such a platform would be helpful, and to really find that golden screw somewhere where it eventually may be available.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. I mean, this finding like a shared standard, and I think what I believe, if you look at first principles, right, the fundamental data model of electronics and the supply chain, I think, is fairly clear. There are some like maybe nuances, but in theory, the fundamentals are pretty clear. And I think every player that will start to like build something on their own will probably converge to a similar schema if you think about a database perspective.
Yeah.
But I'm personally a little bit skeptical that this gold standard will just organically emerge. I think history has some reason told us differently. However, I think if everyone now starts to like provide API interfaces following some open API standard, that's not that big of a problem, right? Because then you can start mapping one system to the other with like cool integration platforms where you can just pipe data through, but it's in the cloud. It has at least the interfaces are standardized, and then this is, I think, the more likely scenario that we will see different standards or gold standards that are kind of then interconnected, which will lead to a similar outcome, but that can probably happen a lot more organically.
Yeah.
And if you think about, but the question is, who should really do that, right? I think every company should probably ask themselves, what's their core competency? Are you in the game
Exactly.
of manufacturing electronics or in the game of building software. And I would say most companies in the electronics industry are probably not experts in building their own in-house software and should maybe leave that to an external vendor that is really putting their sweat and tears in this one product.
Yeah, it's also a resource question.
100%.
How many software developers do you have in a normal company that is normally concerned with manufacturing goods or with distributing goods? So software development is normally centered around your ERP system or your warehouse management system, but not necessarily on e-commerce or API and that kind of thing. So you need to rely on external partners.
And what you also said was this cost of ownership, right? And I think that's where some companies are continuously fooling themselves. They're way too optimistic when it comes to calculating true cost of ownership, developing software, hosting it, maintaining it. And but I see this trend, right, with like software as a service arriving as a business model and delivery model, that more and more CFOs in the industry are really leaning into the flexibility and the reduced upfront costs that this out-of-house strategy provides. And that's why I'm optimistic that there will be a shift away from homegrown solutions, because SaaS has really made like getting started with a new solution extremely cheap, has sunken the costs of entry, and you can bring this more to your OpEx, right? You don't have to, it's not capital intensive. And I feel that specifically when inventories are getting tied up, there's one thing to worry less about: your capital expenditures in that front.
That's true. And I think when I remember back maybe 10 years, the discussion about cloud started. Not a lot of people had the trust in cloud computing as they have today. I would say a normal cloud environment is probably much safer than the typical internal company network or solution. And therefore, things have really changed also from a cost perspective. But let me spring two things on you that are very important from supply chain perspective. One is more related to distribution. It's the way how distribution serves the actual market, whether it's an OEM or an EMS company. And I think one of the misconceptions is that distribution just buys and sells components. In reality, distribution offers many, many services that mostly are not really well paid for. So the discussions that mostly never happen with customers is really around this as a service piece. So what kind of problems do you have? How can we help you solve them? And being paid for that rather than just for selling components. And do you think there is a feasible concept for, let's say, service as a service, not just software as a service, but also service as a service?
I think, yeah, that's also for me like some of the frustrating parts is that some people like are super willing to pay for consulting services, but software is not supposed to cost anything. And I think it's similar to the direction that you said. There are these like services that are embedded in distribution, like the factoring that you do, the logistics that you do, whatever, that are just expected. But I think in a sense that the more all of these different services that can be unbundled, right? So they are now different. You can have logistics as a service in a sense, and APIs help you to have basically some long tail sales as a service. The more it will be clear what the different elements are and were from this model. And I think maybe this will maybe lead to some people realize that this is something that isn't for free, because if you are like trying to cut through the margins on components, for example, you kind of squeeze this down, then you, of course, someone has to pay for it. And then some of these embedded services are now maybe not feasible anymore because they have to be charged somewhere else. And I think with this transparency, these services might be unbundled, and that might also raise the awareness from people, and thereby ideally, hopefully also allowing them to do a real return on invest analysis per service, and then hopefully lead to more appreciation, ideally.
It would be kind of interesting because I think ultimately we'll go that way. We have seen that in other low margin businesses, in other distribution sectors in the industry, like in the pharmaceutical industry or the medical industry. Everywhere you have seen the same development, but so far in ours, it for some reason hasn't really happened. So my last question is around your hobby, artificial intelligence. So you're giving tutorials on LinkedIn. I've seen that. So you have made videos where you explained artificial intelligence in different steps, and so generative AI and so on. And do you think there is a big potential for artificial intelligence in our supply chain business?
Yeah, so I think in general, what I think I often tell people is like in the electronics industry, I'm happy that I think we can still sleep at night because like the whole generative AI hype is, which has very disruptive potential for some industries and some roles, is I think we're in a good position to just make systematic use of it, but not be scared to death because it's going to change completely how the industry functions. So I think that's maybe the good news first. But maybe taking about the utilities, I think definitely this whole generative AI part is, I think, has not so disruptive for the whole supply chain situations. I think many of the algorithms that are helpful in supply chain have already been around and can still be helpful. And I think there's definitely different elements to what you can look at. I think one is, and that's how can you like harmonize data, process data, and reduce human manual effort to kind of clean up some data corps that some other people have like created. I think that's one big block. And the other
Yeah.
block is then if it comes to mapping different systems. We talked about this, right? This is where like
Yes.
these new semantic models can help you like connect to different systems faster and APIs faster. And then I think the other part is this whole idea of like finding patterns and making some predictions or like
Exactly.
indications of warnings. I'm always very skeptical about generally this idea of forecasting where of things that are basically just not like you can't predict the future. There's some clear, if you have full information and you know production levels and so on, that's more of a planning scenario. And there you can definitely do some estimations that help you do that prediction, that forecasting very well. But just predicting something from like past patterns is in my mind something that's a little bit like snake oil, where you have to really make sure that you're not fooling yourself.
Snake oil.
But that's definitely I think the elements where we can really see a lot of potential. And then if that's for the supply chain part, these three buckets.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if it's comparable to snake oil, but I think a lot of products have parameters that are very ideal subjects for, let's say, algorithms to interpret how certain probabilities will happen in the future. So just give you an example, a product that is used by many companies. So let's say a semiconductor, a microcontroller with a certain, let's say, structure, peripherals, whatever, memory, interfaces, and so on. It's very popular in the automotive industry. This is a good criteria that can be valued or weighted by AI to see what the future development of availability could be. So I may be wrong. On the other hand, if you have a single source part, not a single source part, but a part that is used only by one customer, a very exclusive part, a C part or so, it could also be differently weighted by good algorithms. The question is how to get there. So how to come to those algorithms that really give you that early warning, that early warning capability that customers could eventually trust.
But you basically nailing it to the point, right? I think, as I said, something that supply and demand, this is like something in economics we know for quite some time, and that is definitely something that will give you a good indication. If you have perfect knowledge about this and you can forecast the puts into the future, you can really very well predict like supply and demand shortages or like supply shortages. But but some people, and if you then have some way of either getting early warnings or having a good approximation of the demand, then that's very valid. But some people are just basically looking at like developments of some prices and curves and try to kind of from just past patterns try to predict something. I think that's something where people are often very over optimistic and we have to be very careful to not like predict, like create patterns where there's no really actual information hidden in certain graphs. That's just my opinion. Yeah.
True. Yeah. Well, with that, I think thank you very much for your information that you gave us. Do you have any famous last words, if I may ask that stupid question?
Famous last words. So I think what we talk about a lot about tools, and I really would say encourage everyone in the industry to kind of like have an open mind, look at these tools, because I think some of them can be a real game changer for the different businesses. And just because something hasn't changed in the last 10 years doesn't mean it can or not will change right now. And maybe personally, if you are like an electronics designer, engineer, or you work in procurement or for an EMS, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or on my email. I'm always like super interested to learning about the issues you're currently facing and to maybe share some best practices that I have seen in the industry.
That's good. Sebastian, thank you for your time, and thanks for actually working with Sourceability. We are really happy to have, let's say, the cool kids on the blog as well. And let's see what we can do in the future to actually make the supply chain more transparent together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Looking forward to it.
Goodbye.
Bye.